Thank you, everybody, for joining me on Mother's Day. Just a little aside before I begin. I didn't realize this was Mother's Day when I had to postpone last week. We're talking, as you know, about the mother's gaze. So there's a little bit of synchronicity there. I didn't even realize it until about an hour ago. We're going to be looking into this fascinating subject of the effect of the mother's gaze or the gaze of our primary caretaker on the development of our emotional lives, on our ability to feel empathy as well as to love. Okay. How we bond or don't bond as infants with our primary caretaker, which is usually the mother, has profound effects on how we see ourselves in relation to others, whether we feel safe or unsafe in the world, whether we believe ourselves to be seen, held, appreciated, belonging, or, on the other hand, invisible, abandoned, neglected, and alienated. Are we able to love, trust, open, and commit, and feel safe in intimacy with others, or does intimacy feel too threatening? Okay, these are the questions that we're going to be exploring today. And also looking at the effect of the mother's gaze on our spiritual lives and the shape of our longing, uh, which is a fascinating connection because often we are attracted to forms of spirituality that satisfy those early primal needs in ways that we're not even aware of. So let's begin at the beginning. When a baby looks into its mother's eyes, that connection becomes the child's refuge. It becomes the mirror where she or he first confirms their own existence. From this doting reflection in its mother's eyes, a baby draws its earliest wordless lessons about connection, about love, about care, and also about how it looks when we lose the mother's gaze, when we're looked away from, which every child is sooner or later, and how that makes the good feeling disappear. This all important connection, which the novelist George Eliot called the meeting eyes of love, is a sort of mother's milk for the emotions. According to Dan Siegel, whose work you may know, a psychologist who specializes in early parental bonding, every child yearns for and must have this eye contact in order for healthy emotional development to occur. Siegel, who started a field of research known as interpersonal neurobiology, has proved that the mother's gaze plays a critical role as well in how we develop empathy. Here's how he puts it, quote, repeated tens of thousands of times in the child's life, these small moments of mutual rapport serve to transmit the best part of our humanity, our capacity for love, from one generation to the next. Let me repeat that. Repeated tens of thousands of times in the child's life, these small moments of mutual rapport serve to transmit the best part of our humanity, our capacity for love, from one generation to the next. Isn't that great? Through mirroring, a baby's attachment to her caregivers helps the immature brain to use the mature functions of the parent's brain to organize its own processes. In other words, we learn to care, literally, by observing the caring behavior of our parents toward us. Okay? We learn to care by observing how we are cared for. It's a circular movement. And when we look into how this happens, it only becomes more miraculous. It turns out that we are born with a set of cells in the brain called mirror neurons, which make love and connection possible. Mirror neurons were actually only discovered in the 1990s and are truly mind-blowing. And here's the story of how they were discovered. It was 1995 in Italy, and a neurologist named Giacomo Rizzolatti was conducting an experiment on monkeys in his lab when something extraordinary took place. The scientist and his team were studying the region of the monkey's brain that's involved in planning and carrying out movements. And when the monkey would take hold of an object with its hands, cells corresponding with that region in the brain would activate and cause the monitor to beep. But then The amazing thing happened, the eureka moment, by accident. Because in the middle of doing this experiment, a student of Rizzolati's entered the lab holding an ice cream cone. When he lifted the ice cream cone to his mouth, the monitor attached to the monkey's brain started to beep, even though the monkey hadn't moved at all. In other words, by watching the student lick the ice cream, the monkey's brain responded exactly as if it were doing it himself. Okay? At first, the scientist just couldn't believe what he was seeing, because quite by accident, he had discovered a special class of cells that had fired in the monkey's brain simply because it had observed an action. And Rizzolatti called these mirror neurons, which are far more refined in us than they are in monkeys. What this discovery demonstrated is that we're born with hardware in the brain whose sole purpose is to enable us to harmonize with our environment, to reflect inside ourselves actions that we observe in others. Isn't that amazing? As Rizzolatti put it, quote, mirror neurons allow us to grasp the minds of others, not through conceptual reasoning, but through direct simulation, by feeling, not thinking. So the discovery of mirror neurons opened up a whole new way of understanding how we connect with the world, how we bond, how we learn, especially when it comes to empathy and love. Mirror neurons are the reason that we yawn when we see other people yawn. We actually blush when we see other people blush or flinch when someone else is struck. It's also why we start to laugh when we are around people who are laughing. We are mirroring these actions with unconsciously and harmonizing with our environment. They've actually found that people who test high for what's called contagious yawning tend to be more empathic. So just think about that. Mirror neurons are the reason why emotions, both negative and positive, are so contagious. In order to understand other people and to connect with them, we actually become them a little bit and bring the outside world inside by way of our own nervous systems. So when we talk about putting ourselves in another person's shoes, mirror neurons are the reason that we're able to do this. They're the reason why people who live together for a long time come to resemble one another by mirroring each other's expressions. That's called the Michelangelo effect, by the way. It's also the reason for the brain-to-brain imitation that causes babies to stick out their tongues when you do and cry when they hear others crying. By mimicking what another person does or feels, mirror neurons create a shared sensibility and imprint our neural pathways with imitated emotions. And it's also why when we see another person's pain or disgust, it's almost exactly like being disgusted or in pain oneself from a brain standpoint. Social emotions like guilt and shame, pride, embarrassment, disgust, lust are learned in precisely the same way from observing the responses of others, beginning with our parents. As we gaze out onto the world as babies, we're reading the faces and gestures of those around us, especially our caretakers, and etching into our own brains a repertoire for emotion, behavior, and how the world works. Okay? A newborn baby, barely able to see, can imitate the facial expressions of adults within 1 hour of delivery. And this motor imitation feeds the emotional system. Merely seeing the picture of a happy face will elicit activity in the muscles that pull a child's own mouth into a smile. And the same goes with crying almost from birth. Children become sympathetically upset. It's also interesting to learn that people with conditions like autism and folks who are on what they call the spectrum may have what they call broken mirror neurons that deprive them of bonding skills as well as empathy. So these discoveries about mirror neurons have thrown a whole new light on the question of the mother's gaze and how we learn to love and bond through imitation. By the age of 7 months, these earliest attachments have led to specific organizational changes in an infant's behavior and brain function. 7 months. When a secure base is found in the world, the child learns emotional resilience. If the caregiver is responsive to the child's signals and interacts with sensitivity, a secure attachment will be formed. And that reinforces the child's own positive emotional states and teaches her or him to modulate negative states. But deprived of the mother's gaze, the area of the brain that coordinates social communication, empathic attunement, emotional regulation, and stimulus appraisal, which is the establishment of value or meaning, will be faulty. Okay? Let me repeat that. The area of the brain that coordinates social communication, empathic attunement, emotional regulation, and the establishment of value and meaning will be faulty in folks with insecure attachment. And insecure attachment creates all sorts of subsequent losses in self-esteem, feelings of belonging, and so on. They've seen in laboratory experiments that infants whose mothers deliberately ignore them become agitated and distressed. Instead of crawling around like the babies that are paid attention to, they stop exploring the environment and they either brood alone or they desperately solicit their mother for attention. It's not surprising that children of mothers who have postpartum depression tend to be anxious and distressed themselves. Now, without sufficient healthy mirroring, children deprived of the mother's gaze are likely to feel disconnected from others later in life. And many of us may seek to heal this disconnect in destructive ways, which range from dysfunctional love to substance abuse. We can also channel that hunger into spiritual seeking, which we're going to be talking about at length later. In fact, there's a profound link between the emptiness that's caused by a mother's absence and the spiritual impulse itself, with its goals of acceptance and benediction and unity. There's an interesting story about Pope John Paul II, who lost his own mother at an early age. And he was intrigued enough by Dan Siegel's work on the mother's gaze to invite Dan Siegel to the Vatican, actually, for a private meeting to discuss how the pontiff's being orphaned had impacted his psychological and his spiritual life. From all this, it's easy to understand why the mother's gaze and the meeting eyes of love have such a deep and a lasting effect on who we become, what we yearn for, what we believe about the universe, whether it's benevolent or malicious, safe or unsafe, and how empathic we're able to be with others. Now, I'd like to tell you a story about a woman whose life illustrates insecure attachment vividly. She was adopted and she never knew her biological mother. Even though she was highly intelligent and deeply creative, as well as financially self-sufficient and physically attractive, this lady had a nearly impossible time finding happiness in her life. I'll call her Lisa. A majority of the time, Lisa moved through her life feeling deeply alone, unseen, and unwanted. She was 55, unmarried, and childless, and unable to sustain intimate relationships with either romantic partners or with friends. And that's because she tended to suffocate other people with her need. She would oppress them with her fears and accuse them of all kinds of rejection and coldness, abandonment that had little to do with reality. No matter how much people loved Lisa or reassured her or showed their generosity, nothing was ever enough. It reminded me of the line from Slouching Towards Bethlehem, the Yeats poem, "The center will not hold." There seemed to be a God-sized hole in her center. And no matter how much love or care or faith or belonging were imbued into her through relationship, they just went right through her. They just leaked right out of her. And this left Lisa in a very, very painful state of dread and self-doubt. She was abandonment waiting to happen. She was forever the victim, and she lived with the sincere belief that nobody could be trusted, that no matter what she did, she was always going to be alone. Now, as you can imagine, trying to have a relationship with someone like that was quite difficult. Friends and lovers, as well as colleagues who became involved with Lisa, were held guilty before being proved innocent. As happens with a lot of deeply wounded people who haven't looked at their own shadow, Lisa's shadow began to run her life, and she wound up manifesting the exact behaviors that she accused other people of. Believing herself to be the victim, she in fact became the perpetrator of great hostility and aggression. Even though she craved love and acceptance, she was highly judgmental and withholding. She never felt that she had enough or was enough, so Lisa made others feel insufficient. Anyway, she came to me wanting to investigate these patterns, which were so destructive and alienating in her life, through writing. She was bitter and angry and full of self-pity. Lisa told me that she'd never loved anyone in her life. She was almost 60, and she had never felt like she had opened her heart to another human being or experienced true intimacy. And she didn't want to die that way. And she said, I don't want to come to the end of my life without knowing how it feels to trust people or to let them in or be able to give. That was her deepest grief, as we discovered the more she wrote. Not only that she couldn't receive from others, but that she wasn't able to give of herself. And I find that very moving, that as much as we crave love, we long just as much to give love, because when we don't feel alive. When Lisa talked about herself, she used the word stillborn to describe her life. She said, I feel like I'm a stillborn person. Anyway, I asked her to write about what she meant by this and about her earliest experiences of connection to her adoptive mother, the eyes that she saw reflecting her back, as truthfully as possible, not analytically, but viscerally, emotionally, to write about how these memories were held in her body and what stories she had about these memories. Anyway, Lisa was intimidated, but she agreed to do her best. 2 weeks later, she sent me a 5-page description of what she remembered from being a very young child. And here the plot thickens. It turns out that her adoptive mother was a kind of neglected child herself. She was emotionally damaged from her own youth. And she was terrorized by Lisa's adoptive father. Lisa described her as scared of her own reflection. She described her as a sweet, ineffectual, abused woman who worshipped her father but could never please him. And that what she saw in her mother's eyes was great sorrow. She said, I remember looking at her and feeling pity, knowing that she wasn't strong enough to protect me. Now, Lisa's father was a sarcastic, self-centered tyrant kind of a guy with a very cruel streak. She hated him, but she adored him as well. And as she got older, she came to see her mother through her father's eyes as a failure. And she learned that when she treated her mother that way in front of him, he treated Lisa better. So they would gang up on her until her mother was in tears. Lisa said, I feel like I had two choices. I could be nobody like she was, to be sweet and kicked around, or I could be mean like my father, who people might not like very much, but who at least got a little respect. As a child and as a young woman, Lisa had felt trapped between two opposite, equally harmful reflections, either to see herself as weak or strong, loser or winner. And understandably, she chose the latter because she knew what was happening. She realized it was better to be angry than sad, as she put it, and that if the world was a brutal, judgmental, godless place, the world that her parents revealed it to be in their very different ways, at least she would be able to survive by closing her heart and being nobody's fool. But of course this was a devil's bargain, and it had set Lisa up for all kinds of suffering and self-sabotage. Especially being a woman who was raised to identify more with their father, this very hard-as-nails patriarch, or her soft, vulnerable mother. By identifying more with the father, that created a lot of trouble with Lisa's self-image as a woman. And the more she explored these early unspoken lessons and agreements, She came to recognize the similarity between the unsupportive attention that she'd received from her mother, a woman who didn't have the freedom to give, and Lisa's own inability to love and support others. Okay. She realized that she had not been given the power of love reflected to her to learn how to mirror as a growing up person. A few years, so Lisa wrote with me, and then she disappeared. And then a few years after we stopped working together, I got a letter from her that was very, very moving. She told me that after her father died, her mother was alone, and Lisa had become her caretaker because there was no one else to do it. And what ended up happening is that she lavished the love on her mother that she had longed for herself. And actually developed in the last 2 years of her mother's life a very caring and tender bond that comforted her mother as she aged and also brought a deep satisfaction to Lisa's life. What she'd done is reversed the natural order of things and healed in her ability to love her mother. Those became some of the most significant and beautiful moments of her life, she told me. And she'd gone from being an angry, defensive, self-pitiful woman to being a loving, soft, and open human being by learning to love her own mother. Now, I find this enormously inspiring because it says that we have within us the capacity to transcend our early bonding once we become aware of our conditioning and can develop new pathways to love and to connection. We can learn to feel loved and place ourselves in the universe by first experiencing the lack that we feel, looking at the dimension and the shape of our wound, and then setting about with spiritual work to mend the damage that was done by our parents. Psychological work is very important as well, to examine what we know of what happened and, even more importantly, our story about what happened. But the mind can only take us so far in the realm of emotional transformation. In order to broaden our perspective enough to release the darkness of the past and to see ourselves against a universal backdrop beyond the biographical me, it's necessary for us to discover how, by whatever means, some kind of a transpersonal perspective, a witness perspective, a perspective that connects us to the greater whole without losing sight of or feeling for our early painful experience. What it means is stepping out of the story of pain without disassociating and framing experience in spiritual terms. What that means is seeing even painful experience as currency toward our awakening. It's seeing loss in the service of liberation, as grist for the mill that sets us free. Now, because at the center of this whole matter of the mother's gaze, there is a paradox. There's a paradox, and it's very well known to spiritual seekers. And that is that this early loss of maternal or paternal connection can end up being the greatest instigator for spiritual connection later on. And think of the story of the Pope, who lost his mother and then dedicated himself to the Mother Church. What we realize is that our primal hungers lead to existential seeking, which leads, if we persist, to wisdom and to the knowledge that our capacity for love isn't destroyed when early abandonment happens. In fact, it can be intensified. When we learn to identify our own longing and channel it in the direction of awakening and healing and freedom, extraordinary growth is possible. Then we expand into bigger people, deeper people. Having known this pain of loss, we also become more compassionate. Instead of being lost in self-pity or in grief, as Lisa was when we first met, instead we open the door to the larger world and use insecurity as a bridge to other people in pain, to share the grief of this human life as well as its joys, and to not be trapped in our own past. In order for this to happen, though, it means doing the spiritual work of moving beyond the personal ego, the small me, to release infantile clinging and bitterness. Clinging and bitterness are natural residue of maternal longing. But as long as they're blocking us from seeing clearly, we can't open our hearts or give to other people. What this means is learning to deeply care for ourselves and to practice giving others the love that we long for. If we don't do this, if we don't make that spiritual movement, that transcendent movement beyond this little story, it only gets worse the older we get. I'm sure you've seen that in your life or in the lives of people you know. If you don't deal with the shadow, if you don't deal with the absence, the void, the walls just get higher. The fears just keep getting bigger. The isolation just keeps growing, and eventually it drowns out our joy. Part of the paradox of insecure attachment as a spur to spiritual growth is the fact that insecure people are often also the kindest, most accessible, and most willing to be generous, because we know how it feels not to have those things. Okay? At the other end of the spectrum, individuals with secure beginnings, kind of charmed lives that allowed them to feel powerful and worthy and loved, can tend toward arrogance and insensitivity when they're not careful, especially toward people in pain, whom they view as broken and somehow responsible for their own situation. Okay, that's what Buddhists would call the near enemy of security would be arrogance. Unless folks with secure attachment acknowledge their own wounds, they can fall into self-righteousness and superiority. And that's why it's just as important for people with secure attachment who've led charmed lives to engage in spiritual practice somehow. It's ironic because secure people are actually at a disadvantage when it comes to a commitment to spiritual practice, because they had the mother's gaze and they don't feel a need for reconnection because they've never felt disconnected. So ask yourself, where do you fall on the spectrum of security? And where has this early learning affected your spiritual life? What is it that you seek in spiritual practice? When you think about God or a higher power, do you project childish needs onto that image? Okay. Do you view your higher power as a mean father writ large? Do you view your higher power as a compassionate, loving, seeing, tender mother writ large? Do you approach God with shame and neediness? With praise and celebration and gratitude? With defense and arrogance? These are very, very important questions to ask ourselves as seekers. What hunger is it that has brought you to the spiritual path, and what is it that you hope to find? When we look into these questions, it gives us a lot of insight into our own being and where we may feel disconnected. I want to finish by reading a prayer that articulates what I'm trying to say about the mother's gaze through mirroring and how we transcend ourselves in order to find ourselves, as well as anything I know. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born again to eternal life. What St. Francis is saying in that prayer is that the source is within us. That's what the mother's gaze is meant to teach us. When we receive it from our physical mother, it's a blessing. It's a great and precious blessing. When we don't and must find it for ourselves later, through seeking and struggling and healing and learning, the gift is equally precious. We come to see that we are part of the source of that love, and that our birthright is to be seen and loved, to know our own goodness, and to mirror back the goodness of others. That's how we reach our potential as people, by recognizing the mother within and seeing ourselves through tender eyes that accept us and that bless us along the way.